Welcome back to the 1619 Project. My name is Antonio Ruiz, and with me is Thomas Fields. Thomas, how are you?
I'm doing really well, Antonio.
So we're talking today about dispossession in this chapter. And I really have to start off with the opening line in the chapter. On November 18th, this is on page 136, on November 18th, 1785, a contingent of Cherokee people arrived at Hopewell Plantation on the bucolic banks of a South Carolina river for a meeting that would help set the structure of the American racial hierarchy for centuries to come. I just got blown away by that one sentence because it just really does begin to lay out how Europeans began to sort of lay out this landscape where we are at the top and everybody else is below us, and we'll let you guys fight it out as to who's below us. Although they went to a lot of great lengths to make sure that African Americans were at the very bottom. And they used Native Americans, indigenous people, to help do that. Before we get into specifics of this chapter, what was your general reactions to it?
Well, let me go back to what you said, because I think it bears repeating. To me, it's a little more insidious than what you laid out.
Yeah.
Because part of how, for example, the British conquered the world where the sun never set is because of a strategy they put in place, which is divide and conquer.
Yes.
And as
exactly.
And as one of the British commentators at that time said, when you go into a village, you would appoint the guy that you want to head, your intermediary. It's the guy you see. You put a necktie around his neck, and that's your man. And this is notoriously what the Brits did. They divided and conquered people. And this is no more the same thing. And one of the things they pointed out in the chapter was that Native Americans and African Americans got together, whether it was for personal reasons or whether it was for political reasons. The first thing they did was they separated. And because they did not want allies. They did not want them to become allies. And that's true all over the world.
Oh, yeah.
People of color, where the Brits, and I suppose the same thing goes true for Europeans in general, don't allow them to see they have a common goal, a common enemy, any kind of commonality. That's, to me, the significance of that.
You know what in this first pages here, what stood out to me, for instance, that this is a meeting with first the Cherokee Indians this is we're talking here in the Southeast, where they would negotiate what was called the Treaty of Hopewell.
Mm-hmm.
And what was interesting in these first paragraphs, first they started talking about General Andrew Pickens, who was the person who was assigned to help negotiate this treaty. He was a formidable South Carolina militia leader during the American Revolution, and he had two other people who came through. He was joined by three men from elite families, and all of them. What was common among all of them was that they were all enslavers.
Yeah.
And here we're talking about is. I think not just that they were enslavers. Again, it's the mindset here of we are the conquerors.
Mm-hmm.
We are here to commit our will upon you, the Cherokee, and eventually they did it with the Choctaw and the Chickasaw nations. And I thought that was so interesting. But there was this little line in here. This is on page 137. That at first I just sort of like, I didn't understand it right away. And this is talking about General George Washington and his role in all of this. This actually continues. I think it continues into the next page as well. On page, it's on page 140, but it starts here on this page 137. General George Washington awarded Pickens 573 acres on the Kiowa, I'm mispronouncing this, I'm sure, river. And it talks about how he's basically just, dividing up land that belongs to the Cherokees. But because the Cherokees sided with the British in the American Revolution, obviously the British lost. It was time for, to the victors belong the spoils. But if you jump to page 140, and he talks about, we're talking about George Washington here. He talks about how this is before the revolution, that George Washington held financial interests in the westerly lands.
Oh, sure.
Right. And as one person said in a book called The Indian World of George Washington, the revolution was not only a war for independence and a new political order, it was also a war for the North American continent. This wasn't, this is what gets lost in this whole discussion about the American Revolution is, we like to oversimplify, fantasize this idea that this was all about freedom when it was actually about economic separation from England, but it was also about the elites and the commercial class and their ability to exploit the land that was before them and damned their way.
Yeah. It's one of those
indigenous people were part of the people who were in their way.
Of course. One of the things that I wish could happen, people talk about critical race theory and outlaw teaching of but what I would love to see replace it will be a teaching on the Constitution, having the reading of the Constitution. Because therein you see exactly how the nuts and bolts of how this country was founded. It's pretty upfront. And for that matter, so is the Declaration of Independence. Property was 3/5 of, let me rephrase that. Slaves were 3/5 of a human. I mean, that's pretty upfront. Property rights extended to human beings. Not only that, some of the ills we have today, such as electoral college, comes out of that notion.
Right.
And it's, of course,
to satisfy the South.
Yeah, and it is embedded in the Constitution. So okay, scrap critical race theory. Let's teach the Constitution.
I don't want to get too hung up on this whole debate about CRT, but I will tell you that much of what's happening today, and some of it is right here in this on page 141. This idea of this so-called rebellion against critical race theory, this idea of hanging on to the Second Amendment, this idea of we are going to protect this vision of America as, and it talks about it here, this idea that we people of America is founded on this English and European principle of that we are the masters. We are the white supremacists. This is what drove imperialism. This is what drove colonialism. It wasn't just simply that we went and bartered with local people for their riches. No, they went in and stole it. And in the process, exterminated people. And this is what's interesting here is that the British also saw native people as unchristian heathens and as savages who had not actually developed the land in a civilized manner that would qualify them as rightful owners. The doctrine of discovery, a longstanding belief that Christian nations had the right to rule over non-Christian nations and their properties, helped justify English imperialism despite prior native presence. And this concept was carried forward by those who came here. I mean, we have to remember that the majority of the people who came here, I'm talking about white people, were Europeans.
Of course.
They came from England. They came from France. They came from Spain. They brought this principle of the doctrine of discovery with them and set about implementing in this country what they pretty much have been doing already for several hundred years around the world.
You know what the hypocrisy is in this? You talk about Christian, the fact that, for one, there's a concept that these people are not civilized. And it is our right, our duty to civilize them by bringing Christian values to them. Of course, the great hypocrisy, just ignore everything, but the fact that when those people became Christians, they were still considered property. It did not change their status. So to me, where is the uplifting of Christianity, the uplifting of civilization, even if you adopt their principles, their religion, you still are property. You're still cattle. And that's, to me, and even continues to this day, which is why, having been raised very much in a fundamental Christian religion, I have issues with that, applying those tenets to my own personal life.
Yeah, and I made a note here that I'm really. This is why what gets lost in this whole discussion of critical race theory is the flip side of it, which is the white supremacy. Because they don't want to discuss that. They don't want to discuss the psychological, cultural characteristics of white supremacy. That Europe saw it, and this extends to why we have this. The European canon, the Western canon, is taught because we have elevated European culture, or they have elevated European culture to be like, anything less than that is uncivilized. And you think to yourself, boy, you should take a look at your history, European history. You guys were not exactly the most civilized people I've read about.
Even by their own standards, they're not.
I mean, seriously, let's talk about the Dark Ages. Let's talk about even the Middle Ages. You love to talk about the Renaissance, but what you don't talk about is the class warfare. What you don't talk about is some of the really bizarre practices, including the religious wars, the papal, the Roman Catholic practices. I mean, you can go on and on and on. But my point is that, and then of course, this idea of going forth in colonialism, and my point is that the whole white supremacist that we talk about here today in modern day United States has its roots in this concept of Europe being this, basically, I don't know, pinnacle of civilization, only held together because of military might, not because it has proven itself to be any more superior to any other civilization at the time, particularly civilizations that have been around way before the Europeans. And I think it's important to understand though that line from Europe to modern day white supremacy, for us to really begin to understand what they did in terms of setting up this hierarchy of white Europeans, and then using Native Americans against African Americans. I thought that was so important that we need to talk about it at some point.
Well, I'm looking forward to the discussion we'll have on capitalism, because that actually dovetails into what you're discussing now, which is it's really why I think white supremacy exists, in whole, because you are making money, you're profiting. I mean, capitalism is about profits, and in order to justify slavery, you had to put the boilerplate Christianity on top of it. That's what I find the most disgusting part of this whole discussion about slavery, capitalism, Christianity. Christianity has been used basically as a cover, as an excuse for slavery. And the most insidious thing about it is you taught the slaves or the Africans who came over here that it was not only was it okay, you need to pick up this religion, become a part of your own enslavement.
Yeah. It's it's been used world over. All you have to do. I mean, the missionaries were really good at this. If we can just get them to believe in our God, we can control them.
Mm-hmm.
With indigenous people, I mean, one of the things that I found really interesting in all these treaties that were done, of course, treaties that were eventually all broken by the federal government. But this is on page 145 when they start to talk about, for instance, in an address to Congress in 1791, George Washington outlined 6 principles for federal relations with Native people. These included delivering impartial justice, whatever that means, regulated methods of land sales and trade, and the rights of government to distribute diplomatic presence, penalties for those who violated Native rights, and rational experiments for imparting to them the blessings of civilization. I love that last line. And the idea was this is how we're going to treat the Native people. Well, the reality is that they didn't take them long to ignore all of these things. And part of it was this idea of the civilization program that assumed that Indians would recognize the superiority. I'm sorry. Here we're back to the same thing, that the civilization program, Washington urged Congress to create let me back up here a second. Washington urged Congress to create a plan for promoting civilization among friendly tribes. This is on 145 in the middle of the page. But that civilization program assumed that Indians would recognize the superiority of Western cultures and be willing to change without being coerced by force.
Yeah. There is what's telling about that, and there's a phrase in this chapter that talks about teaching the indigenous people about property ownership.
Yes.
And what is really fascinating about that is because if you teach them the value of ownership, property ownership, you can then parcel up their land. And once you parcel up their land, then, and they're supposed to be sovereign states, then you can actually take the land, because you can go and individually negotiate with each one individually to get use of that land.
Yeah.
And that, that again is the role capitalism has played in subjugating these people. you know, behind most great crimes, and I consider invasion and conquest a great crime, there's some kind of motive, profit motive, always.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
And particularly in our country, the profit is the top motivation, and that's what happened with slavery. That's what happened with the subjugation of Native people.
Yeah,
there was a profit in it. The profit of Native people was not their labor, but their land. And the profit motivation with the African Americans was their labor. And what I found truly, and I'm getting ahead of myself, truly enlightening was the number of millionaires in this country in the South versus the North. The South had the richest because they had unpaid labor to do
right. Exactly.
And when
that was the whole point.
And this is, I'm getting ahead of myself, but when I hear people say, well, my family didn't own slaves, so why should I feel any guilt? Why should I see the need for reparations? What they ignore is a couple of things, but one foremost is the fact that that wealth also was generated in the North through things like the textile mills, which used the labor from the slaves and which picked the cotton, which all the cotton up to the North, to then generate wealth when they sold it overseas.
Right.
I mean, that's one. Of course, the other parts are even closer to our own times, is that the fact exclusion of people of color from full engagement in the society, in the economic system, allowed white people to benefit from that. Whether or not they benefit from slavery directly, it was certainly indirectly. And we can talk about how in this country, how people were kept out of the
economy.
Yeah, and that's even today. Going forward today, we can talk about what happens with banks, who they lend to for mortgages, how neighborhoods get redlined, and even when redline's quote unquote illegal, who gets the loans for mortgages.
Right.
So this is an ongoing problem.
I have to say, just sort of bouncing off this idea of the civilization program, it even gets worse. George Washington appointed Benjamin Hawkins superintendent to the Southern tribes in 1796 to translate his plan on the ground, to implement his plan. And then it goes on to talk about what this guy was looking at was a comprehensive cultural change, converting a communal lifestyle rooted in sustainable farming and hunting into an individualistic lifestyle punctuated by private property and male authority. And it just gets worse. I mean, it's talking about how if Native people did not prove that they could rise above savagery and assimilate, Hawkins and others believed they would be crowded out or killed. And one of the defining characteristics of a civilized European society in the South, the enslavement of Black people.
Yeah.
They actually wanted them, although this was not specifically written into the plan. This is on page 146. Natives who enslaved people found favor with the U.S. government, garnering positive reviews in the federal agents' reports and earning government contracts and military honors.
Yeah, I know.
It's like, I mean, I knew all this, but just again, seeing this you can see the insidiousness of this idea of we want to make them like us because we are superior to all of them.
I don't think
how messed up can your idea of supremacy be?
I don't think they want to make them like us. See, that's where, I mean, this is all window dressing. They don't want to make the natives like them. And they're very clear about that. What they wanted to do is make them recognize the superiority of their culture.
Okay, yes.
And the right to basically take their land and subjugate them. But it was never about saying we want them to be like us, because that wasn't in the cards. And and another thing too, just to be perfectly blunt about it, I know we're saying it's us versus them, whites versus people of color, But let's not leave out of the equation that these elites, the landowners, did not particularly care for the newly arriving immigrants who were coming in, who were happened to be white. Their usefulness was only in terms of basically a buffer between them and possibly an uprising of those at the bottom. And they also didn't want those people who they also were against the poor whites. They did not want those poor whites to ever join forces with those other people.
Yes.
Made that
particularly during the 1800s.
What's that?
Particularly during the 1800s.
Yeah.
That was before the Civil War. Yes. And then even after the Civil War, the people who led, who were the foot soldiers of the KKK, for instance. I mean, these were poor whites.
Of course.
Because they knew, anyway, I'm jumping ahead of myself because I really need to go back to one other point here. This is on page 148. And I'm pointing this out because this is where it gets really, really interesting. And this is the Andrew Jackson.
Yeah, yes.
Who was a favorite of our friend, former President Donald Trump. In 1828, Andrew Jackson, of course, surged to the presidency on a wave of populist enthusiasm. Mm-hmm. And this is where he talks about, he urged Congress to effect native removal through legislation. Well, this is, we're expanding as a nation, and certain people are in the way, native indigenous people. And so he goes on, 149, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which authorized the president to remove tribes from their homes and lands east of the Mississippi and relocate them on the land west of the river. And this was signed into law, in 1830. And what was interesting is some of the people who took advantage of this were not just white people,
yes,
but indigenous people. And I mentioned this. So one guy was a guy named, I guess his nickname was Rich Joe, but I'm trying to remember his actual name. Van. Okay, here it is. His name is James Van, a son of a Scottish trader and Cherokee woman. He had defended a collective Cherokee land holdings in negotiations with American officials, but by the early 1800s, he established a large estate, and he was the best example of a native proponent of American-style race slavery. He controlled nearly 800 acres of land, and he owned nearly 70 women, men, and children of African descent. There were those people, both, there were indigenous people, there were even Black people, African Americans, who thought they would take it. They thought they were being blessed, controlling land, controlling enslaved people, but they were being controlled by their white overseers. But they thought, well, this is the idea of cultural conversion. If I'm just like them, they'll look favorably upon me. And I just find that, again, you see this wherever Europeans settled, that they did the same thing. And I think you mentioned this at the very beginning, they picked certain people to sort of be their local. They did it a lot in India. They did it in a lot of African countries. You are now the Maharaja. You're going to control. I'm oversimplifying this, but you're going to be the buffer between us, because we're in a country thousands of miles away. You're going to be our local control.
Yeah.
In this case, it was, we're in Washington, D.C., or we're somewhere above you. We're going to use you to be able to be the buffer between us and the people below you.
So, Antonio, as you read through this, what happened to that family, the bands you're talking about, who in fact had amassed a fair amount of wealth,
yeah,
were conforming to the white landowners in the power, doing what they asked them to do. When that law went into effect, their property was taken.
Right.
As well as
this is on page 149. It talks about this.
Was forcibly taken.
Yeah.
As was their possessions. They were thrown out in essentially a street.
Yeah.
And they escaped with only their lives and some enslaved people who they could be able to bring with them.
Right.
Now,
right.
The question I have to you is this: how does this differ from ethnic cleansing? What we have
doesn't.
Yeah, and that's part of a lot of what has happened in this country. If you look at what happened to Native Americans and others, but specifically Native Americans, it falls in the definition of what ethnic cleansing is, and yet we don't call it that. I think we use some nice words to describe it, but it is ethnic cleansing.
I'm not sure what the nice words were, but
relocation. The westward. Well, it's one of the ways we do say is westward expansion. We use that.
That's destiny. Was that?
Yeah,
it was exactly that.
Yeah, we say westward expansion. We say all of that. But it is and it was ethnic cleansing. In 1838, General Winfield Scott, who was in charge of the removal campaign, what he did was he followed through his ultimatum, telling people at a certain date to leave their property, their land. And he ordered women, men, children, elderly from their homes at gunpoint and bayonet tip, and set in motion the Trail of Tears.
Right.
Forced to abandon most of their possessions, the Cherokees witnessed white Georgians taking ownership of their cabins and all within them. Daniel Buttrick, a missionary to the Cherokees, described what he witnessed. Women absent from their home on visits or for other purposes were seized, and men far from their wives and children were not allowed to return. And also children being forced from home were dragged off among strangers. Cattle, horses, hogs, household furniture, clothing, and money not with them were taken and left. And this is from a Georgia militiaman who also witnessed this, said, quote, "I fought through the Civil War and have seen men shot to pieces and slaughtered by the thousands, but the Cherokee removal was the cruelest work I have ever known." And again, it's ethnic cleansing. We term it the Trail of Tears. I don't think that's what the natives called it, but that's what we have euphemized it as, the Trail of Tears, as opposed to ethnic cleansing.
Yeah. And none of this stuff we should be talking about. We should be teaching our children because, it's going to make somebody feel guilty. Wow. And yet the reality is that these things continue to exist today. I'm on page 151. There's pretty much a summarization of this. Talks about the historian Mary, and I'm going to destroy her last name, Hirschberger, has observed that slavery played a role in the successful passage of the Indian Removal Act since the 3/5 clause of the U.S. Constitution, which apportioned additional representation in Congress for numbers of enslaved people owned, increased the voting power of Southern whites who sought native land. And after the Indian Removal Act had been enforced, white Southerners benefited yet again. The expulsion of Cherokees and other tribal nations cleared the way for Southerners to move with the people they enslaved onto former native lands, an expansion of the kind of slavery that far surpassed Cherokee slavery, because they'd learned to be, Cherokee slavery and intensity and extent. Um, they describe this as the historians David and Jeanne Heidler have put in their book, Indian Removal, the institution of American slavery and the event of Indian removal were both cause and effect twin evils.
Yeah.
This idea that, this idea that we're going to finally comes to roost is this idea that, both the flip side of each other, this idea of Indian removal and the enslavement of people. And in the end, you might try to, and the Europeans tried to get people to do their bidding, to enslave African Americans. But in the end, what did it get those indigenous people, like you said, who were forced off their land, who thought they were safe, and in the end, they ended up losing things. So just more of the same, so to speak. I think that, and the chapter ends with talking about how more and more Indigenous, Black, and Afro-Native activists, because there was this whole part here talking about descendants of freedmen of the 5 civilized tribes, an association which were descendants of African Americans who were enslaved. And it took them a legal suit in 2017, federal court ruling requiring the Cherokee Nation to extend civil rights to descendants of formerly enslaved people after decades of resistance on the part of the tribe. I believe this happened in a few other tribes as well.
It certainly did, particularly those that got money from the casinos.
Right.
Don't want to share any of that. In fact, it's also the case with those who have left the casino, and we're talking natives themselves. There's this whole thing about membership, and you can be a member of not a member of a tribe. You can be one who is a full-blooded, so to speak, native, and still not share in the bounty of the tribe's casino revenue because you're not a registered member. And so it gets into whole.
There was a big New York Times article about this some years ago, where there was discussions about how, casinos, money, capitalism, corrupts people, and how they take advantage of loopholes or create loopholes so that a smaller group of people can control things. But anyway, we digress. I think what's interesting in this whole dispossession, and I'd like to hear your take on this, is you sort of keep coming back to it, this idea about capitalism. But I guess they're really sort of the flip side of each other. This idea that this Western concept of superiority, of supremacy, that is brought over to this country by European settlers, and who then begin to implement, they've got all these vast resources in front of them, and the people who are standing in their way are indigenous people, and then using both indigenous people who are enslaved and then using them to enslave, and then Africans who are brought here as enslaved people to basically work for free. This idea that it didn't end at any point in our history. It continues today. This idea that it's almost baked into our culture that it's about, they love to talk about, conservative Republicans love to talk about, giving people something for nothing, when in fact, capitalism is about trying to implement laws that give you something for nothing, that give you, that utilizes the labor. If you can listen, there are people who believe there should be no minimum wage because, the market will decide. Well, that's been proven to be not true because people are desperate. They'll sometimes work for nothing.
Well, the market will decide. I'm sorry, the market will decide if you let it decide. And guess not to your benefit.
Right.
Okay, so it will decide for those who are on top, where that floor is, and likely where the ceiling is as well.
Right. I just want to take a few seconds, minutes if we can, to talk about the mindset, the white supremacy mindset, because I think that's so critical in not only this chapter, but in the capitalism chapter. And even in some of the other chapters dealing with fear, for instance, jumps into my mind. I mean, I can see where it comes from, Europe, but I'm trying to think about it today in modern times. Because it's not just people who have a lot of money. I'm talking about Joe Schmo. I'm talking about your next door neighbor who is the blue collar person. And then how other people kind of buy into this. I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, obviously, it's a learned behavior. I mean, you grow up. It's hard to escape the fact that there is a pecking order. There's a totem pole. It's hard to escape the fact that in the social totem pole, it's reinforced by this belief that people who have color in their skin or their hue are going to be at the bottom and they're lesser than. I am hopeful because I think it's starting to weaken that correlation between one's skin color and one's I don't know what a good word for it, one's equality has nothing to do with each other, But what I have noticed, and you bring it back to contemporary issues, what I have noticed, if you are a person of color who is successful, you are really going against a belief system that's been embedded in many people's minds. And those people, when I'm talking about white people, react in ways which are strange to behold. They will come up with some of the weirdest and sometimes destructive actions and language somehow against you because that is not what they believe. That's not their norm. And it also gets into their psyche. Their psyche is, for many of them, that, hey, by just the virtue of my skin color, I'm born with certain advantages. Those advantages should continue through my lifetime. If I see someone who violates that, then that psyche is really troubled by that. That psyche comes into threat. It's just, and one of the great terms I love out of this whole, out of the new awareness we have is fragility, white fragility, and it's real for some people. And I have to make sure people understand it's not every white person I'm talking about, but it is a significant number who hold the beliefs that if a person of color is elevated to the same level, or God forbid, they are beyond.
You mean like become president of the United States?
That's one, but it doesn't even have to go that far. In a social structure, if they see a person of color who somehow or another exceeds them in their status, they are troubled by that. It really fucks with their psyche. And how they behave is really quite interesting if you can separate yourself from your emotions.
Yeah. Well, as we go through the rest of the book, I mean, we're going to keep coming back to this idea. Obviously we talk about the historical perspective of this, but I got to keep coming back to looking at it also through modern, contemporary eyes.
Of course.
Because, I like to consider myself a student of American history. And what we're going through right now, this whole anti-critical race theory, this idea that, God, I just so dislike this idea that we're fighting wokeness, although I don't even know what that means anymore. And I don't think they know what that means anymore.
They don't know what it means. I'm talking.
This idea that any push against white supremacy, any push for social justice, things that we were just talking to somebody recently about this. Here is 2022. We're still talking about things that we were talking about in 1966, 1968.
Mm-hmm.
Same stuff, same issues, fighting the same fights.
Yeah, but Antonio, there's no surprise there. I mean, if you say that this country was never a true democracy, and I mean, which we know. I mean, up until the 60s, the mid to late 60s, it was illegal for many people in this country to vote. Okay, I mean that's not a definition of a democracy. So if even you take the basis of what a democracy is, which is one person, one vote, that really did not take effect in this country until the Voting Rights Act, which was in the 60s. And even then it was subverted, and it's continued to be subverted. But let's just take that. One of the things that happened in this country, which is, I think, different from a lot of European countries, when you talk about capitalism, is that we had the twin evils of yoking it to slavery. And slavery, which then returns with capitalism, which is about exploitation, be it exploitation of your resources, of your markets, and of your people. You hitch that to slavery, and you've got a dysfunctioning society built into it. And that's what we're dealing with now. We have a dysfunctional society which is not coming to grips with how do you fucking rectify this thing called slavery and its aftermath.
Yeah. Well, we'll continue this discussion in our next podcast. And you'll see continuing a lot of the same themes.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's all tied together. All right. Well, yeah. So it doesn't stop. You're right. So thank you very much for listening to Antonio Ruiz and Thomas Fields' discussion of the 1619 Project.
See you, Antonio.